think about our presidents kind of one at a time, probably because we elect them one at a time. There's going to be a winner and a loser in a month. We read about them one at a time. We think of them serially. What Nancy and I wanted to do in the President's Club was something a little different. We wanted to look at them together. We had an idea that presidents, while in office, one right after the other, actually have relationships with each other, which might tell us something about the men, the office, and the problems our politics have. We wanted to climb into this conversation. We wanted to find out what the men who spend so much time, and so far it's only men, trying to figure out what we want and we need. We wanted to know a little bit more about what they want and need from each other. And the astonishing thing about the world's most exclusive fraternity is that it's unlike any other club really in America. It has its own rules, its own taboos, its own rights and responsibilities for its members. It has its own set of partnerships and its own rivalries. And the astonishing thing about it is that it didn't really exist until about 1945. And then it began when two people who probably least expected it and were least likely to start it somehow found a way to do just that.
So you have to go back to the spring of 1945 when Harry Truman had been president for about an hour and a half. And among the problems he was facing was the fact that Europe was so devastated by that war that 1 in 4 children in many cities weren't making it to their first birthday. And the person who actually knew the most about solving what looked like it was going to be a huge humanitarian catastrophe, the person who had done this after World War I, the person for whom streets were named all over Europe because of his engineering genius in preventing a humanitarian disaster. Unfortunately, that guy had left Washington in 1933 as the most hated man in America, with his motorcades pelted with rotten fruit. And every time anyone had suggested to Franklin Roosevelt, you ought to call up Herbert Hoover, he really knows about humanitarian relief, Roosevelt would say, I'm not Jesus Christ. I am not raising Herbert Hoover from the dead. So Truman, who knows he needs help with this enormous problem, secretly mails a letter to Hoover asking, will you come see me? Hence this photograph, which neither man ever imagined would ever be taking, of the two men meeting within weeks of Truman taking office. Hoover is back in the White House for the first time in 13 years. Neither man really trusts each other at all. And yet over the course of the next few months, Truman gives Hoover a plane, a staff, sends him to 22 countries in 55 days, where Hoover meets with 37 prime ministers and 7 kings and the Pope, all in the interest of moving food from the countries that had it to the countries that needed it. And these two men working in partnership in 1945, 1946 were so successful together that they arguably saved more lives than any two figures in the 20th century. There is no conversation so sweet as that between former political enemies, Truman said. And these two men were proof of that. And so, having worked together throughout Truman's presidency, they encounter each other on the platform of Dwight Eisenhower's inauguration in 1953, and Hoover goes over and greets Truman and says, I think we should form a president's club. And Truman is, great. You be the president, I'll be the secretary. There is the creation story. Except if Hoover, an enormously unpopular president, was able to do so much to help Harry Truman, imagine what you could do with a popular president. So Dwight Eisenhower entered office the most popular man in America, maintained an average 64% approval rating throughout his presidency, and left office as the most popular man in America. And so when the oldest president in a century hands over the keys to the youngest president in a century, that is the transition between Eisenhower and Kennedy, Kennedy realizes he needs to be very, very, very careful about how he treats his predecessor, a man for whom, incidentally, he had very little respect, and the feeling was mutual. Eisenhower referred to Kennedy as Little Boy Blue. Kennedy referred to Eisenhower in language I can't say in this company. And yet, 4 months into Kennedy's term, when the Bay of Pigs invasion goes so disastrously wrong, he calls up Eisenhower, says, will you come meet me at Camp David so we can talk? This was literally a trip to the woodshed for a rookie president who had made any number of mistakes in the planning and execution of that operation. And so these two men walk the paths of Camp David. Eisenhower grills him about how did you make your decisions, who did you listen to, did you change the plans as it went along? And Kennedy is shaking his head and saying, you know, no one knows how tough this job is until you've been in it for a few months. And Eisenhower says, forgive me, Mr. President, I tried to warn you of that a few months ago. And yet, this photograph, a version of which ran on the front pages of every newspaper in the country, was the picture that Kennedy needed. And the headline in the New York Times the next day was, Eisenhower urges support for Kennedy on Cuba. And when a bunch of Republican congressmen came to see Eisenhower the following week, delighted that the Kennedy honeymoon was over, Eisenhower says, I don't want any witch hunting. I don't want any raking over of the ashes. We need to talk about how we can move forward better. In the same way, on the night that Kennedy died, Lyndon Johnson picks up the phone, calls Eisenhower, says, I've needed you for a long time. I need you more than ever now. And now these two men, one Democrat, one Republican, sit down together over lunch the next day. Literally, Eisenhower gets in his car, drives to Washington, views Kennedy's body lying in state, and then goes to see Johnson, and writes out in longhand on a legal pad, here's what you need to say to a joint session of Congress. You need to promise that you are going to fulfill the noble objectives of your great predecessor. Now, Eisenhower didn't think Kennedy's objectives were noble, and he didn't think he was great. But what he thought at that moment was that more than anything, the country needed to hear from their new president continuity and stability, and that everything was going to be okay in that moment of trauma. Again and again and again, we kept seeing presidents acting with one another in private in ways that we never expected, in ways that often contradicted their own self-interest, in ways that contradicted their party's interest, in ways that were much more about what the country needed at that time. That was, however, not always the case. As with these two. There are rivalries within the club, and there are treachery and betrayals and backstabbing. And in the case of Richard Nixon and Lyndon Johnson, it was at an epic level. It was a political chess match played across 3 continents, 5 years, 2 presidential elections. And it was important because the stakes were so high and because both men cheated. In the 1968 election, you'll remember, that was the year Bobby Kennedy was assassinated, Martin Luther King was assassinated, the streets of this city turned into a war zone. And all Lyndon Johnson wanted as he was leaving office was to save his reputation as a peacemaker and end the Vietnam War with honor. And Nixon brilliantly convinced him in a series of incredible private phone calls that Nixon would help him do that, would honor Johnson's legacy, would fulfill his mission, give him full credit for the peace settlement that would ultimately come, until Johnson discovered through some very sensitive intelligence gathering that in fact Richard Nixon was secretly undermining the Paris peace talks and telling the South Vietnamese, don't agree to anything, you'll get a better deal when I'm in the White House. And so with only days to go before that election, Lyndon Johnson and Hubert Humphrey had to decide, would they call out the candidate of the other party for what they were privately referring to as treason? And again, in that case, their calculation was that however serious they felt Nixon's offense was, that the country and the Constitution could not handle that crisis at that time. And so in what Teddy White later called the most noble act of political self-sacrifice ever, they did not confront Richard Nixon. The election went forward, the peace talks fell apart at the time, and Richard Nixon very narrowly defeated Humphrey and spent the next 4 years working very hard to keep Lyndon Johnson quiet and happy.
Now, when we thought about this club project at the start, it was our shorthand. It was a concept, a construct, for this idea of these guys and how they worked and didn't work together. But as we got into it more and more, we discovered they talked about it like a club. Hoover, I think, called it a mutual trade union. Reagan called it a club. And they all granted those who came before them some special privileges as you go through the 1950s and 60s, but nobody was quite as obsessed with his predecessor the way Nixon was with Johnson, because he knew what Johnson knew. So Nixon goes to the trouble not only providing planes and cars and all sorts of things. Johnson is calling so much for things that Nixon finally says, let's just get him a place to live. And so he creates in 1969 a special house on Lafayette Square, essentially the former president's house, which still exists. It has some kind of unusual features even to this day. This is one of the strangest features, the bathtub in the main bedroom. Anyway, and it's a lovely place, kind of like a Four Seasons, but you can only live or check in if you're one of the 4 people. This is the bedspread that has 6 zillion count thread sheets. And if you're not sure what you did before you were sleeping there, you could look down toward your toes every morning and figure out that you used to be the president. The clubhouse, it still exists on Lafayette Square, unmarked building, and they all use it. The club has some unusual bedfellows. Maybe not the best word to use at that particular moment. But here, this is, we say at times some pictures don't need a caption. This is one of them. Jimmy Carter, on September 7th, just 3 weeks ago, became the longest living former president in American history, 31 years, 8 months, 21 days. This required him to have a second career after being tossed out of office in 1980. He has been used by every president in some capacity since. Reagan, Bush, all of them have sent him places. He is a very difficult partner. Usually you can send Carter someplace and he'll do what you asked him to do, but he'll do 2 or 3 things you didn't ask him to do. And Carter will say, I'm a better former president than I was president, which isn't surprising because, of course, he's been at it 7 times longer. On the other hand, he'll also say things like this, I'm a better former president than the other former presidents, which doesn't really endear him to club members. Every club has to have something to rally around, and Jimmy Carter is frequently that. This is a picture most people don't even know existed between a meeting that most people don't think ever took place. When Bill Clinton comes into office in 1992, there are 5, it's the golden age of the club. There are 5 former living presidents. Not since Lincoln's first inauguration have there ever been 5 former presidents. He goes to, they all want to get to know him. He goes to see Reagan in LA. They go up to his office at Century City, and he asks Reagan for advice, and Reagan says, go to Camp David, but he also says, I've watched you on the campaign trail, Mr. Clinton, and you just have the most pathetic salute I have ever seen. And Reagan had an exquisite understanding about the role perception played in leadership, and so Clinton said, well, how do you do it? And Reagan, who, Clinton hadn't been in the service. You remember that whole part of the campaign about not being in the service. And Reagan, of course, had not only been in the service, he'd been in the service in 40 movies. And so he sat there in Reagan's office, and the 2 men stood up, and Reagan told them how to salute. And they practiced their salutes in Reagan's office for the better part of 5 or 10 minutes. And Clinton did well enough, I guess, that Reagan rewarded him with jelly beans afterward. I would just say those jelly beans sat on Clinton's desk for 8 years in the Oval Office. This is one of the stranger relationships of that golden age. These 2 men, nobody wanted Clinton's attention the way Nixon did. He practically stood on Pennsylvania Avenue and waved his arms, call me, call me, call me. And Clinton wouldn't, because he couldn't be hanging out with Dick Nixon. So Nixon started working the back channel and publishing sweet valentines in the op-ed, thinking that'll get Clinton to call him, and that didn't work. And so then he sent him nasty letters saying, if you don't call me, the op-eds are going to get nastier. Nixon's kind of, good cop, bad copping the president at this point. It's just kind of strange. Clinton eventually calls. They become late-night phone pals. They talk about Russia and China, and Nixon's so happy to be back in the loop and talking to the president about the big things. But he's really enchanted by the fact that what Clinton wants to know is, how do you do this job? When do you sleep? What do you eat? When do you get up? And they actually trade a series of letters about that. The club inside the fraternity is a kind of unusual paternity. President Bush 41 is father to one of the other members. He's also surrogate father to one of the other members. Barbara Bush calls him the father he never had. Inside the Bush family, they pay Clinton the highest possible compliment, which is to give him a nickname, which is brother from another mother. The week after the convention in Charlotte, Clinton went up to Kenny Bunkport to have lunch. That was a great, that kind of thing happens all the time. This is another one where the caption really isn't necessary. Good eye contact here. These two men are rivalries for something. You know, one of the things we saw over and over again is that the presidents from different parties seem to get along better than the presidents from the same party. And here's a classic example. You know, Reagan didn't really get along with Nixon. Carter never really got along with Clinton. And these two men, while definitely in league at the moment, if you're in a swing state, you can see the gray-haired man, the more gray-haired man, all the time now, rooting for the other. These men obviously have a very different idea about how to pull a center-right nation a little bit more to the left. They disagree on how to do it. They have different ideas. And of course, there was some hangover still from the 2008 campaign. We'll see what the next stage brings in that relationship. And this is the last time they were all together. Bush brought them together before he left office in 2009. Obama asked for Bush to bring them together, get the band together. Bush said, Carter too? Obama said, yeah, Carter too. So they all got together and had lunch, and they didn't talk about the Middle East, and they didn't talk about the Congress, and they didn't talk about, you know, nuclear proliferation. They talked about, well, you know, how do you stay married in this bubble? And how do you, most of these guys had daughters. How do you raise daughters here? And so it was actually a conversation that wasn't about the things you might have thought. I want to say one more thing about this before we stop, and that is, you know, looking at that picture, I'm always reminded about how, you know, the French just had an election, and they elected Francois Hollande, and at the time, the French pundits said things like, oh, it's great that Hollande's in and Sarkozy is out, because, you know, he really wasn't a typical French president. He hadn't come from the right family and the right schools and the right sort of, you know, class. And you look back at that picture, and you realize, it'd be great to have that picture back, thanks. And you realize, there's no club in America that would have all these guys as its members. And you throw in Ronald Reagan and Lyndon Johnson and Jack Kennedy and Herbert Hoover, and you realize, you know, this is a club we create, and we create it every 4 years. These guys actually have very little say in who gets to be in it. But it's a truly American thing, because that isn't something you could find otherwise in nature. And that's the story of the President's Club. David?